There are 13 people left alive. Some might say they were unlucky, but they were certainly luckier than those who did not survive the crash landing on a remote Pacific island. The beaten survivors clustered on the beach. Slowly, they began to organize themselves, trying to find shelter, water, and food. The pilot, the oldest remaining, did not survive. Margaret seemed to naturally take charge, checking on how people were doing and starting to organize everything. Remarkably, 4 friends survived: Tom, his wife Helen, Bill, and his wife Mary. They were lucky that they were in the rear. Few from the front of the plane survived. They were a middle-class couple in their 40s, enjoying a Pacific Island vacation together when they booked a cheap charter for sightseeing. They were in good physical shape and liked to travel independently. Yes, but most of their trips were invented and planned by Tom. He and Helen were a good match, both adventurous and energetic. Tom is 3 inches taller than Helen, who was 5 feet 8 inches tall. Endurance sports, cycling and running, kept him in good physical shape, but without swinging in the gym. Helen's long, curly brown hair was usually styled in a ponytail, leaving bangs above her beautiful deep brown eyes. She was smart and quick-witted, but sometimes she could be quite harsh and straightforward. They got along well with the quieter and calmer Bill and Mary. Tom and Bill had been friends all their lives, having known each other since they were 10 years old when they ran the streets together, and fortunately their wives got along equally well with each other. Bill was fit, played golf, and did activities that didn't require much effort. Mary went to the gym and swam with Helen. Her shoulder-length blonde hair and blue eyes matched her ebullient personality. Both were extremely popular among a wide circle of friends. Most of the passengers were a group of rugby players, but only 5 of them survived. Another couple survived the disaster. Mike and Kelly were in their 20s. There was also a lone woman who was seriously wounded and remained unconscious. The last survivor was Margaret, their leader, a 57-year-old widow and retired nurse. They were at the furthest point of their tour in an aging twin-engine turboprop aircraft when a storm suddenly hit. For several hours, they were carried by a strong wind, under thunder and lightning. Tom wondered if anyone else knew about their predicament, and his doubts grew when the pilot announced that they would have to make an emergency landing and that everyone should get ready. The impact of the landing was brutal, and the small plane was torn in half after it overshot the intended beach and crashed into the water and then into a reef. The immediate consequences were mass death, injury, and shock. Survival became the priority. All that was visible now was the back of the plane, hanging precariously on the reef as the survivors, their clothes torn, reached the shore. There was little of value left on the destroyed plane: some food, clothing, and a first aid kit, which did little to help them survive the first night, as the storm was still raging. The next day was completely quiet and calm. During their initial searches, they discovered several shelters made from ship planks that had long since been overgrown by the jungle. They guessed that the boards were from a 19th century clipper ship. Then they discovered skeletons. There were 12 of them, and judging by the position of the bodies and the discarded weapons, they died in battle. This was confirmed when a ship's log was found, in which their exploits and a map of the island were recorded. Fortunately, the latter contained useful information about water and food sources. Apparently, there were wild pigs on the island. It was also confirmed that the island was uninhabited at that time. The survivors of the ship remained alone for almost 3 years and, like themselves, had no idea about their whereabouts, since they were blown off course during a storm that lasted several weeks. Over the course of several evenings, Margaret read out their story. More than 20 people survived the first crash, but over time, they lost more people due to injury and illness. At the end of the journal, petty arguments were recorded that gave rise to resentment and eventually hatred, exacerbated by isolation, fear, and lack of food. "Oh my God," Tom remarked, "this looks like Lord of the Flies." He then outlined the plot of the book, in which a group of boys, also marooned on an island, turned on each other with savage cruelty. Partly because of the magazine and some disagreements within their group, They decided to elect a leader and agree on some principles. Margaret was chosen quickly and without any opposition. The principles were more complex, but they settled on the following. Survival is the main goal, including food, water, and shelter. Alarm was chosen as the next priority. Tom suggested collecting all mirrors and shiny surfaces to signal, but he ignored Adam's rugby team captain, quipped that the tail of an airplane was a more obvious signal. There was no point in arguing. The fact that the plane was washed away the next day later proved his point. They also agreed to support the beacons and work together as a community, sharing everything. All decisions will be made for the benefit of the entire group by the leader, but on key issues, everyone will have a say. Bill added another priority, burying the dead, both recent and skeletal. Sad to add, they now include Amy, a lone traveler who died peacefully in her sleep without ever regaining consciousness. Partly to record her death, Tom began recording their history in the ship's log. The group started out quite well. They had shelter and water, but there was not enough food, so they organized food production, hunting, and underwater fishing. At first they were sure that they would be found, but they never saw a single plane. Tom realized that they had been drifting for several hours during the storm and wondered if there was even a flight plan, since the airfield was rudimentary at best, nothing more than a rough grass track. He also questioned how bad the storm was in the region, and if everyone was recovering from the cyclone, would they even look for a small, occasional charter flight? However, I decided to keep this information to myself. As hope for a quick rescue faded, outbursts of anger began to appear. A few weeks later, quarrels began over the women with accusations of flirting. Mostly it was between younger husband Mike and members of the rugby team, whom he accused of groping his wife, Kelly. Tom noticed that the captain of the rugby team, Adam, was constantly hanging around his wife, Helen, and the youngest guy on the team, Dan, was constantly hanging around Mary. He tried to quietly inform Helen of this so as not to start another argument. She was rather dismissive of his concerns. It didn't help that their clothes were becoming more and more threadbare, revealing quite a bit of bare skin. Things came to blows when Zach, one of the rugby players, punched Kelly's husband Mike, who hit back in a rage. By the time they were separated, rugby player Zach was unconscious and bleeding heavily. Margaret called for restraint, pointing out that they did not have medical supplies and would not be able to treat serious injuries. The rugby players were furious over their friend's injury, and discontent between factions was rapidly growing. It was Adam who explained that they should have everything in common, but there is something that they did not share. The three married guys were furious. It almost came to another fight. Margaret only managed to calm the situation by telling everyone to separate and cool down. Margaret discussed her problems with each of the wives, subtly asking if any of them wanted to offer comfort to the young guys, their testosterone clearly on edge. Helen, as always, was direct and to the point. "Do you mean full-fledged sex?" "I haven't gotten to that point yet. We're just exploring all the possibilities. Our husbands will never tolerate this." Mike might give in to Kelly. He didn't want to hurt Zach at all. Opinions were divided and no decision was made. "Try mentioning this to your husbands. Let's see what they say. Expect them to be against it, but read between the words to see if there is any hidden recognition of how precarious our position is." The ensuing discussions led to nothing other than increasing tensions. They discussed the matter again in a meeting with everyone present. Adam demanded, due to the importance of the issue and the current impasse, that a vote be held. Margaret agreed, but only to see how things were going. All women had a choice in this matter. 4 young boys voted in favor of comfort sharing, as it was phrased, and 3 husbands voted against it. Mary and Kelly also voted against it. Everything is almost decided, Tom thought, but was completely stunned when Helen voted yes. He looked at her in complete bewilderment. Since Zach was unable to vote despite Adam's statement that he would be in favor, Margaret now had the deciding vote. Margaret noticed the tension and insisted that everyone consider their votes, as nothing would happen for several days. "I would encourage you all to discuss the possible consequences. Our continued survival depends on it." Helen tried to explain, her voice to Tom. This is serious, we are already quarreling, and everything can only escalate. Zach may not survive what you think will happen if he dies. Compared to this, a small affair is nothing. This is funny. They are half your age. This will cause even more quarrels and resentments, and you seem to be to carry it away. Look around, Tom. There's no one their age here except Kelly, and she's already having to deal with everyone fighting over her. It is natural that they need female company. At their age, they should be dating, and they have not gone on a date for several months. We are lost and trying to survive. In this situation, social norms do not apply. Who knows when or even if we get off this island, you can't expect 20-year-old guys to suddenly become celibate indefinitely. How convenient for you. We can't expect it, but it looks like we can throw away the vows we made to each other. It's only a big problem if you make it so. This doesn't mean I think less of you. But you didn't think that I could think worse about you, my future unfaithful wife. Of course, I thought about it, but I know that you understand my reasons and are strong enough to cope with the situation. What will happen if Adam demands to take power? You won't be able to fight everyone. We need a way to appease them. Margaret spoke quietly with Kelly and Mary, asking about the consequences depending on how the vote went. Specifically, whether they would agree to make a group decision on an issue that they, as individuals, had every right to reject. This was not a decision she wanted to force on the wives. A few days later, Margaret appeared before the group. As I already explained, we cannot afford to get injured. Even minor cuts and bruises can become infected and fatal. We have no effective medicine and nothing that would help Zach recover. I talked to all of you young guys. You admitted that you were upset and angry, not knowing how long we would be here. We cannot ask you not to be attracted to the opposite sex, and you do not have the opportunity to do what comes naturally now. We must accept that this is an isolated, emergency situation. In this environment, normal expectations and boundaries no longer apply. We have a different type of community where we have agreed that everything is shared and we take care of all of us as a group. The arguments were still the same ones Helen had given earlier. Tom wondered if they had gathered together to agree on their script. I'm glad to offer myself, but I understand that at 57 years old, I may be unattractive to young men. I think I would make the same offer if I were younger and in your shoes. You know, I was pretty sexy back in the day. She added the last comment, trying to bring a little humor to a difficult situation. Greg, one of the young guys, burst into the conversation. I would like to accept this offer, and I think that you are still very attractive, and I really appreciate that you are willing to do so. It would be an honor for me. Margaret smiled. Thank you, I agree. And if and when Zach gets better, I will take care of him too. There remained an equal number of wives and unmarried men. The math and conclusions were obvious. One at a time. Mary tried to suppress her feelings of panic. Now everything was becoming too real. She said she would support the overall decision, as would Kelly. I instruct each wife to take a lover. This is my decision as a leader. Don't blame or try to change anyone's mind. We all have to accept this for the good of the group as a whole. This is absolute nonsense, Bill growled. You can't vote for someone to do this or vote for us to just accept it. All the wives agreed to accept the results of the vote, Bill. Margaret tried to say it kindly, but it didn't help. Judging by the devastated look Bill stared at Mary, Margaret continued, Each wife will draw the straw. The one who draws the longest straw will choose her lover first, after which the wives will be obliged to take care of his needs in the same way as their husbands. There should be no relationship outside of these agreements. Lovers should treat both wives and husbands with absolute respect, understanding that this can cause great stress and difficulty. Nothing will happen for a few days until we get used to the idea and we have everything under control. Tom ran away, quickly followed by Bill. Helen and Mary ran after them, trying to convince them that everything was for the best and that everything would work out. The next day, Mary found Helen looking at young guys. Deciding which one you like? Life on the island seemed ordinary to Helen, and she was forced to admit that she liked looking at young guys. They are all in such good physical shape. with developed muscles and tone. The idea of taking care of some of their needs seemed very attractive. "Have you seen Adam? He's so fit." Mary smiled. Yes, it's hard not to notice him. And Steve began to walk around with a boner, not paying attention to those around him. "To survive, we need smart young guys." "Oh, I don't know, your Tom actually works harder. He's the only one who can hunt and fish with any success. The younger guys are just better posers." "So, what do you think about this? Did you vote against the agreements?" "I think I don't mind. But this is not something I would have thought about before the accident. But I'm worried about Bill. He doesn't talk much. I think he can handle it, if I'm attentive to him." Helen didn't pay much attention as she watched Adam approach. Her mind was occupied with comparisons to Brad Pitt in the movie Troy. "Hi, Helen. I just wanted to ask if this happens. Do you already know who you would choose?" "Not really. I assumed you all would want Kelly to choose you. She's 23 and pretty after all." "Oh, I don't know. You and Mary are very attractive, mature women. I'm sure either of us would be happy if you want to take care of us. I hope you'll consider me as an option." "Actually, I'm shocked." "Why me?" "Well, mainly because I like you as a person. We get along well, and this could become a long-term thing. But physically, you are hot." "But she hardly looks like Kelly." "Yes, but I like you better. Your figure, slender, like an hourglass, and Kelly is flatter. I like your curves. This is a real female figure. To put it bluntly, I would say that your tits are huge and I can't take my eyes off them. Your ass is in great shape too. One thing I can say for sure, I would love to take possession of you." Adam laughed to himself and added, "I like your eyes and face." The next day, Adam was at the stream completely naked and washing himself when he saw Helen approaching. She stood spellbound. Adam smiled, allowing her to clearly see himself in all his glory, and finally Helen averted her eyes and disappeared. At the same time, Mary was talking to Dan. "Can I just say that if this happens, I hope you will consider me?" Mary was puzzled. "I'm much older than you. How old are you, 25? 23. But I like you. I really like you. You're funny, easy to talk to, and so caring. You and Margaret are the glue that holds us all together." "Oh, yes. I didn't know you thought of me like that. There is one more thing. You are a confident, experienced woman, and I think that you could guide me." "Lord, I'm not a sex therapist or a teacher." "Sure?" Mary laughed. "Oh, you are an impudent one." Subsequently, Mary thought about it. After all, she is an experienced married woman, and Dan is so young. Obviously, the guys made their choice and tried to establish emotional connections with married women before the selection began. This was very timely and purposeful, as Margaret announced that the selection would take place the next day, which immediately led to a moment of connection between the wives and lovers. Tom sat in the group and waited in horror for this moment. He was sure that the women had thought through their choices in advance to avoid any conflict, and he would end up with the worst possible outcome. 3 wives drew straws, with Helen drawing the longest, giving her first choice. She approached Adam, smiled, and led him by the hand to one of the shelters. The look of joy on Adam's face was the polar opposite of Tom's expression of rage. He thought about running after them, but she had made up her mind, and it was her own free choice. He sat motionless, trying to hold back the bile rising in his stomach. Mary came next and chose Dan. She nodded to him but did not move to go with him. Kelly remained Steve. Mary turned to her husband, Bill. "Why don't you, Tom and Mike, go and wander around? It will be easier." She waited until they started to get ready and then walked over to Dan. Just before leaving the camp, Tom heard Helen's first moans of passion. He could not stand it and rushed forward. When the husbands returned about an hour later, everyone was sitting around the fire except Helen and Adam. Mary tried to stop Tom as he approached the shelter. "Tom, don't..." He looked inside and heard muffled conversation. "You like what's going on, don't you, Helen?" "Yes, I like it." "Whose are you now?" "Yours, all yours, beloved." Tom turned, picked up his backpack, and left the camp. The rest of the camp looked at each other awkwardly, but realized that it was better not to try to stop him. Eventually, Helen and Adam left the shelter and returned to the fire. Noticing Tom's absence, Helen looked at Mary. "They got back about 30 minutes ago. You were still busy." He looked into the shelter and ran away. Helen panicked. 30 minutes ago? Damn. "What's the matter?" Mary asked worriedly. "I said something, and if he heard it, then everything is bad," Adam intervened, placing his hand on Helen's thigh. "Don't worry, Helen, he must accept the new order of things. And if he doesn't accept it, that means we'll have more time." Helen ignored Adam, thinking that it was idiotic of her to get carried away and have a third round with him, and even more foolish to engage in conversations about sex. The first time was frantic and fast, the second was calmer, but no less exciting. She was amazed when the third one started, and it seemed like they were having sex forever. To be honest, Helen was tired, and talking about sex was meant to make him relax. Mary talked to Bill, trying to calm him down. "How are you doing about all this?" Bill shrugged. "Actually, it's pretty damn bad." "Sorry, I never thought it would be so difficult. Dan was normal, if that helps. Respectful and attentive. He knows how difficult this is for you. We didn't have sex, I just offered him some release." Bill looked at her in confusion. "We kissed. We thought it would be easier to wait until you went hunting." Maybe at least you're not as obviously impatient as Helen. It might be easier to just announce that we are no longer married or together." "What? No, never say that. I love you more than anything in the world. Nothing will change that. It will just help us survive. If the group breaks up, we will become like those skeletons, turning on each other. Don't be so sure that your decisions won't lead to this, Mary." This pent-up anger goes both ways. Tom didn't return that night, despite what the young boys thought. Tom was more competent than any of them, but his current mental state could be guessed. Despite her worries, Helen allowed Adam into bed with her again that night. His toned body was simply irresistible. Mary spent the night with her husband Bill and tried to warn her friend to focus on her husband. When Tom did not return the next morning, they decided to send search parties. Tom hunted for 2 days and for the first time did not return to camp with the results, but alone, enjoyed the sweet taste of a wild pig. He heard the search parties and easily bypassed them, returning to the main camp. Unfortunately, Helen was there waiting for him, alone. Seeing him, she lowered her eyes. He paid no attention to her and sat down by the fire. She asked if they could talk. Tom thought that sooner or later this would happen. "I regret the way I treated Adam. It was more harsher than I wanted." "Wow, sincere apologies," Tom chuckled. "And then we got carried away, and I didn't want you to see or hear this." "No, I think you wanted to maintain intimacy for your young boyfriend, whom you have been pursuing for several weeks, and who now owns you." Helen closed her eyes as she heard the echo of her own words. "Come on, Tom. Grow up. You know that this is all talk, part of increasing desire and arousing someone. All this is nonsense, and his pride requires feeding. You know what, Helen? I don't believe a single word you say anymore. Look at me, Tom. I'm already over 40. In the real world, I wouldn't have this chance. What if it was Jennifer Lawrence or Scarlett Johansson dropped in here and they needed sexual release? Would you actually say no or secretly satisfy them? Which would be even worse. Maybe you just don't know me as well as you think. But let's say you're right, and I couldn't resist. I wouldn't rub it in your face. You barely waited until you had your first choice. I didn't leave you, but I admit that I got carried away. Forgive me." "Why him? He's such a moron, an arrogant jerk and pretty useless in terms of helping us survive. He can't do a damn thing. Your sex with him is not for the sake of survival, but only because you wanted it. You clearly don't regret doing this. You're just sorry that you seemed too keen." "Well, yes, there is probably something in this. I'm not going to pick the smallest, least attractive guy to boost your ego. I like Adam, and you have to accept that, and accept that this is a different reality." "So what? There won't even be an apology? I just have to come to terms with it?" I think then it's clear to me where I am.